What if one man's refusal to settle for good enough ended up reshaping the way the entire world communicates, learns, and dreams? We live in a time when a single swipe on a glass screen can connect us to billions of people, when a pocket-sized device can hold our memories, our work, our ideas. But behind this revolution was not a company, it was a relentless dreamer. His story is not just about technology, it's about vision, courage, and the belief that you can bend reality itself if you refuse to give up. In the 1970s, a young college dropout named Steve Jobs walked barefoot across campus lawns, searching for a sense of purpose. He had no grand plan, no safety net, only a restless curiosity and a belief that life should be about doing something that truly matters. From his parents' garage, he and a small group of friends built something the world had never seen before. A personal computer, not for scientists or corporations, but for everyone. It wasn't just a machine, it was an invitation to dream bigger. But the path was not smooth. Success came fast, and so did failure. At just 30 years old, Steve was forced out of his own company. Most people would have taken the blow as the end of their journey, but for Steve, it was the beginning of a new chapter. He poured his energy into new ventures, Pixar, next, and returned to Apple years later, stronger, wiser, and more determined. When the iPod, iPhone, and iPad were born, they didn't just change technology, they changed human behavior, culture, and even language. Steve's obsession with simplicity, beauty, and meaning turned devices into works of art and transformed the way we live. Steve Jobs proved that the greatest tool we have is not in our hands, it's in our minds. And when you dare to think differently, you just might change the world. The Audemars Cupertino was sharp, the kind that made the leaves on the maple shiver before drifting down to the damp ground. Steve Jobs walked barefoot across the cracked concrete of Reed College's campus. It was not because he couldn't afford shoes, though his pockets were undeniably light, but because, as he would later say, he liked the feeling of connection to the earth. The cold bit into his skin, yet it kept him awake, kept him present. Around him, the world was moving in currents he didn't quite belong to. Students lugged textbooks thick as bricks, faces buried in schedules and obligations. Professors passed in their tweed jackets, their voices humming with academic certainty. Steve moved through it all like a shadow, unregistered, unpaid, and entirely unanchored to the institution whose hallways he wandered. He had dropped out months earlier, no lectures to attend, no grades to chase. He carried instead a different kind of weight, questions that throbbed in the quiet corners of his mind. What was the point of spending his parents' savings on classes that meant nothing to him? Why pretend to be someone else's definition of successful? His parents, who had worked so hard to send him here, didn't know exactly what he was doing with his days. But in truth, he didn't know either. The cafeteria smelled faintly of burnt coffee and overcooked pasta. Steve slipped in, grabbed an empty ceramic mug from a stack, and poured himself hot tea. He would sip it slowly, make it last. The steam curled around his face as he scanned the room, not looking for friends, but for signs, patterns, threads of ideas hanging in the air. It was in these in-between moments that his mind wandered farthest. He thought about the world beyond these walls, the humming factories of Silicon Valley, the first wave of personal electronics trickling into stores, the unpolished dreams of engineers who believed machines could do more than crunch numbers for corporations. He didn't know how yet, but something inside told him he was meant to play a role in that story. Later, he'd find himself in a calligraphy class, not because it was part of any degree requirement, but because the sheer beauty of the craft pulled him in. The way each letter curved, the balance between black ink and white space. It wasn't about utility, it was about soul. He didn't know it then, but these lessons in form and elegance would seep into everything he built years later. By night, he'd crash on friends' dorm room floors, his head resting on a rolled-up jacket. Some nights, he'd walk the streets instead, the lamplight stretching his shadow long across the pavement, his breath clouding in the chill. He felt broke, yes, but he also felt strangely free. In the quiet hours, he would imagine a different kind of future, one not built on fitting into the system, but on bending it. Not a world where technology was cold and complicated, but one where it was warm, intuitive, and human. He didn't yet have the pieces, but somewhere deep down, the vision had already begun to form. The campus at night was a different creature, quieter, lonelier, and strangely electric. The sharp smell of wet asphalt lingered after a light drizzle, the lampposts glowing like small moons in the mist. Steve's footsteps were soft against the path as he wandered, aimless but searching, his mind looping the same thought. There has to be more than this. He had always been restless. Even as a kid in Los Altos, he'd torn apart radios just to see the guts inside, not caring if he could put them back together. His father, Paul Jobs, a machinist and craftsman, would sometimes watch him from the garage doorway, shaking his head with half a smile. Paul wasn't a man of many words, but his lesson stuck. If you're going to build something, make it beautiful, even if no one else sees the inside. Steve carried that like scripture-dotted reed, though beauty felt buried beneath endless assignments and theories he couldn't connect with. He skipped the classes that bored him, but slipped into the ones that stirred something inside. A topography lecture here, a discussion on counterculture there. He wasn't chasing credits, he was chasing sparks, little flashes of meaning. One evening, in a dimly lit lounge that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and coffee grounds, he overheard the students debating whether technology could ever be human. One argued it was impossible, machines were cold, logic-bound, incapable of emotion. The other insisted it was inevitable, that art and engineering would one day merge so seamlessly that people would feel technology, not just use it. Steve didn't join the conversation, but the words rooted themselves deep in his mind. He began to notice the intersection everywhere, how a perfectly designed chair seemed to invite you to sit, how a typeface could make you trust or doubt the words it carried, how a well-built tool could feel like an extension of your own hands. The seed of his future obsession was there, not just making things work, but making them sing. But passion didn't pay for food. Some nights he scavenged Coke bottles from trash bins, returning them for the 5-cent deposit to buy something to eat. Other times, he'd walk 7 miles across town to the Hare Krishna temple just to get one free meal a week, warm, spiced vegetables and rice served on metal trays. The sound of chanting filling the hall. He wasn't religious, but the ritual comforted him. On those long walks back in the dark, he'd tilt his head up at the stars. Their cold lights scattered across the black sky. They made his own life feel small, but not insignificant. If the universe was this vast, then the human capacity to create, to shape a tiny corner of it, was even more precious. It was during one of these walks that a thought struck him, not a full plan, not even a clear idea, but a pulse. I'm not going to follow their path. I'm going to make my own. This thought didn't come with certainty. That was a constant companion. What if he was wrong? What if his parents had sacrificed for nothing? But every time he considered returning to the safe, predictable path, something inside refused. The world didn't need another cog in the machine. It needed people willing to tear the machine apart and rebuild it better. The next chapter of his life was waiting just outside the edges of his current world. An unassuming suburban garage, a pile of spare parts, and a friend who saw technology the way he did, not as an end, but as a beginning. It was a lazy afternoon in Silicon Valley, the kind where the air was warm enough to make you want to slow down, but the mind refused to rest. Steve Jobs was back in Los Altos, wandering the neighborhood streets with no real destination, suburban. Lawns lay neat and still under the sun, but somewhere behind those white fences and quiet sidewalks, a revolution was about to find its first breath. A mutual friend had been nudging him for weeks, telling him about a guy he had to meet. You'll get along, the friend had said. He's into electronics like you, actually. No, not like you. He's deeper. He can build anything. Steve wasn't sure what to expect, but when he finally met Steve Wozniak, it was less like meeting someone new and more like recognizing an old frequency you didn't know you were tuned to, was older by a few years, with an easy smile and a spark of mischief. Behind his wire-framed glasses, where Jobs was intense, was disarmingly warm, but beneath that soft exterior was a mind that could bend circuits into things most engineers would call impossible. Their first conversation lasted hours, bouncing from microprocessors to music, from counterculture ideals to the sheer joy of making something just because you could. They weren't talking about building an empire. They weren't even talking about money. They were talking about possibility. What showed him a project he'd been working on, a small computer board built just for fun that could actually display characters on a screen. To Jobs, it was like seeing a door crack open to another world. He saw not just the board, but the people who might one day sit at kitchen tables, typing away on machines like this, creating, learning, communicating without needing to touch a Mainframe in some distant corporate lab. Jobs leaned forward, eyes locked on was. We could sell this, he said. The word's not so much a suggestion as a challenge, was laughed, shaking his head. Sell it. Who would buy it? This is just a hobby machine. Jobs shook his head in return, almost impatient. No, you're not seeing it. This isn't just for engineers. This could be for everyone. Students, kids, people at home. We could make it simple, friendly. It's not about the circuit board, it's about what it means. That was the first moment a shared vision began to take root, was have the technical genius. Jobs had the ability to see beyond the metal and wires to imagine the human connection. Together, they weren't just going to build computers. They were going to change the relationship between people and technology. The sun had long dipped below the horizon when Jobs finally walked home, the conversation still crackling in his mind. He could feel it like standing at the edge of a wave just before it breaks. The world was shifting under their feet, and they were going to ride that shift all the way into the future. In the weeks that followed, Jobs became relentless. He pushed was to refine the board, to think about design, to imagine how they could present it to the public, and when was hesitated. Jobs filled the air with conviction. They didn't have an office. They didn't have funding. What they had was a suburban garage, a few tables, a soldering iron, and two minds that couldn't stop chasing the same idea. From the outside, it looked like nothing. From the inside, it felt like the beginning of everything. The garage on Chris Drive didn't look like a birthplace of revolutions. It smelled faintly of motor oil and dust, with a few cobwebs clinging stubbornly to the rafters. A battered workbench stretched along one wall, scattered with screwdrivers, pliers, and spools of solder wire. The cement floor was cold even in summer, and when night fell, the single hanging bulb cast a yellow circle of light that felt like a campfire. For two restless dreamers, Steve Jobs moved like a man on a mission, pacing the narrow space while Wozniak hunched over the bench, a soldering iron in hand. The tip hissed against the metal contacts, a sharp tang of heated flux rising into the air. Tiny sparks glinted in the gloom as connections came to life, one silver bead at a time. Jobs didn't solder much. He wasn't the one who could make a circuit hum into perfection. His genius was elsewhere, in seeing the horizon before anyone else. He hovered at Woz's shoulder, his voice low but urgent. Think about it, Jobs said. Not just a board, not just a machine, something people want to have in their home, something they can touch, and it makes sense right away. We make it beautiful, was chuckled. Eyes still fixed on the motherboard. Beautiful doesn't make it run faster. Jobs grinned, sharp as a blade. No, but it makes people care. And when they care, that's when the magic happens. Outside, the California night wrapped around the neighborhood. The hum of a distant street lamp mingled with the faint whine of cicadas. Inside, the garage felt like a sealed whirl. Every sound magnified the scrape of a chair leg, the quick inhale before a steady exhale of breath over cooling solder. They worked through the small hours, hands cramped, eyes burning, but their energy didn't fade. Jobs would occasionally disappear into the kitchen, returning with mugs of black coffee that tasted like burnt determination. Would run a quick test, green code flickering to life on a monitor salvaged from a thrift store. And Jobs' eyes would light up as if you were seeing the future because, in a way, he was. But dreams, no matter how vivid, cost money. Jobs took out Jobs returning Coke bottles for change, selling a treasured VW microbus to buy the parts they needed, was sold his prized HP calculator, the one he'd used for years, with barely a second thought. Every transistor, every resistor, was a small gamble on a bigger destiny. The first units were rough, raw bare boards without cases, but when they powered on, when letters and numbers appeared on the screen, it felt like opening a portal. Jobs could already see the next step: cases, manuals, packaging. He could see it on store shelves, in homes, in the hands of people who'd never touched a computer before. The garage became their cathedral, and each night was a service to the gospel of possibility. Outside, the world slept. Inside, the future was being soldered together, one glowing connection at a time. And somewhere deep inside Steve Jobs, a truth crystallized. They weren't just building a product. They were building a bridge from the cold, mechanical world of computing to the beating, human heart of creativity. Morning sunlight spilled across the driveway of 2066 Chris Drive, painting the garage door in soft gold. Inside, the place was in chaos, empty coffee cups balanced precariously on circuit boxes, a pile of tangled wires in one corner, and cardboard boxes half filled with motherboards lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. Steve Jobs stood by the workbench, running his fingers over one of the boards as if it were a piece of fine art. Wozniak was nearby, tightening the last screws on another unit, his hands steady, his face calm. The two of them looked like they'd been up all night again, and they had. Jobs had an appointment that day, and it wasn't just any meeting. It was with Paul Terrell, owner of a small store in Mountain View called the Byte Shop. Terrell was one of the first to sell personal computers to hobbyists, the kind of man who'd seen dozens of projects come and go. Jobs knew they'd have only minutes to make an impression. They loaded a handful of boards into Jobs' beat-up blue Volkswagen van. The seats were littered with old receipts, a rolled-up sleeping bag, and a few cassette tapes still in. The Beatles, some Bach. Jobs climbed behind the wheel, barefoot as usual. His hair slightly unkempt, but his eyes burning with focus, was slid into the passenger seat, cradling one of the boards like a newborn. The drive to Mountain View was quiet except for the hum of the van's engine. Jobs was rehearsing in his head not a sales pitch, but a story. He never sold products. He sold visions. And today, he would need to make Terrell see not just what was in his hands, but what it could become. The Byte Shop was a modest place, more workshop than retail store. The front windows were cluttered with electronic kits and a few clunky terminals. Inside, the smell of solder and machine oil hung in the air. Terrell was behind the counter, tall and composed, with an expression that said he'd seen 1,000 dreamers walk through that door. Jobs placed the board gently on the counter. "This," he said, "is the Apple I." Terrell leaned in, eyebrows raised slightly. "Looks like a motherboard to me," was smiled sheepishly, ready to explain the technical specs, but Jobs jumped in. "It's more than that. This is the first step toward making computing accessible to everyone, not just engineers, kids, teachers, small businesses, anyone. It's powerful, simple, and it works right out of the box." Terrell examined the board, running a finger along the edge. "How many can you make?" Jobs didn't hesitate. "We can deliver 50 in 30 days. Was his head snapped toward him? 50 in a month? They barely had the parts for a dozen, but Jobs kept his gaze locked on Terrell, unblinking. There was a pause, then a slow nod. "All right, 50 units, but they need to be fully assembled. No kits." Jobs smiled, the kind of smile that meant the deal was done before the ink dried. "You'll have them." Back in the van was turned to him. 50, Steve, that's insane. We don't have the money. We don't even have the parts." Jobs started the engine, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "We'll find the money. We'll get the parts. We're doing this." This is how it starts. And so, with nothing but a handshake and a deadline, Apple Computer had its first real order. The clock was ticking, and the pressure was unlike anything they'd faced before. But in that pressure, Jobs thrived. Deadlines weren't walls, they were launch pads. That night, the garage lights burned late again, and somewhere between the hum of soldering irons and the smell of melting wire insulation, the two Steves began to realize they weren't just tinkering anymore. They were in business. The garage had never felt so small. Every inch of the place was crammed with boxes of parts, stacks of unassembled boards, spools of wiring, and trays of tiny resistors sorted by color bands. The workbench was buried under a mess of screwdrivers, soldering irons, and multimeters, their cords sneaking across the cement floor like restless serpents. The air was thick with the metallic tang of flux and the sharp scent of burning insulation. Jobs had transformed the space into something between a factory line and a war room. There was no music now, no drifting conversations about philosophy or design. This was battle mode. Wozniak sat hunched over the bench, his movements precise and deliberate, soldering each connection like it was a signature on a promise. Sweat glistened on his forehead in the yellow light of the single hanging bulb. But the biggest challenge wasn't building 50 units, it was paying for them. They didn't have the capital to buy enough parts in bulk, so Jobs went door to door to suppliers, cutting deals, promising future orders, talking with such conviction that some handed him components on credit. He pawned his beloved Volkswagen van and was sold his prized HP 65 calculator, an object of deep sentimental value to him. To cover the rest, friends and a few curious neighbors were pulled into the operation, their hands shaky at first as they learned how to solder under Woz's careful guidance. Jobs paced like a director on set, checking every board, inspecting each row of connections with the same intensity a jeweler might reserve for diamonds when something wasn't right. His voice was sharp sometimes too sharp, but no one could doubt the fire in his eyes. Nights blurred into mornings, pizza boxes piled up in the corner, coffee pots emptied and refilled. Outside, the quiet suburban street slept on, unaware that in this cramped garage, the foundations of a tech revolution were being hammered into place. Waz's boards came alive, one by one, each green slab breathing electricity through its veins. The faint hum of a working unit filling the air like the purr of a well-fed cat. Jobs would stand over the glowing monitor, watching the characters blink into existence. His mind already 1,000 miles ahead. He wasn't just seeing what was in front of him, he was seeing classrooms filled with students on these machines, living rooms where families learned to type, entire industries transformed. But the deadline loomed like a storm. Each day lost meant a scramble to make up the hours. Jobs pushed harder, driving everyone to move faster, to shave seconds off every step. It wasn't just about delivering on time. It was about proving they could do it at all. The night before delivery, the garage was a furnace of light and sound. Soldering irons hissed, screwdrivers spun, and the smell of hot circuits hung heavy. Was double-checked every board, his fingers moving with the rhythm of a man who knew failure wasn't an option. Jobs boxed each completed unit himself, wrapping them with the care of someone sending his children out into the world. When the sun rose, they loaded the van now borrowed from a friend with the neatly packed boxes. 50 Apple I computers, 50 chances to turn a handshake into history. As Jobs closed the back door of the van, he looked at Woz and grinned, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. First step's done, he said. Now we see how far we can run. And with that, they drove toward the bike shop, carrying not just a delivery, but the fragile, burning promise of what Apple could become. The van rumbled down the tree-lined streets of Mountain View, its suspension creaking under the weight of 50 neatly boxed Apple I computers. The early morning light was cool and clean, the kind of California morning where the air smells faintly of eucalyptus and damp earth. Jobs sat in the driver's seat, barefoot as usual, a focused stillness about him. Wozniak rode shotgun, cradling a single board in his lap, one final unit that kept unboxed. He could demo it in front of Paul Terrell himself. They pulled into the small parking lot of the bike shop. From the outside, it was unremarkable. A low, glass-fronted storefront sandwiched between a laundromat and a locksmith. But inside, it was a temple for hobbyists, shelves lined with electronic kits, cables coiled like sleeping snakes, and the faint, ever-present scent of solder. Terrell was already behind the counter, sorting through invoices. He looked up as they entered, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been amusement at the sight of two young men, hauling in box after box like dockworkers unloading a freighter. You weren't kidding, Terrell said, nodding at the growing stack. Jobs wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. 50 units, fully assembled, just like you asked. Terrell stepped forward, opening one of the boxes. He lifted the board carefully, turning it over in his hands. Inspecting the solder joints, was leaning, pointing out the clean traces, the meticulous wiring. Terrell's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in focus. Not bad, he murmured. Not bad at all. He set the board down on the counter and looked at Jobs. You might actually have something here. It wasn't exuberance, it wasn't a handshake and fireworks, but it was enough. Terrell agreed to put them on display, right up front, where customers walking in would see them immediately. For Jobs, that was the opening he'd been waiting for. He could already picture it, a hobbyist walking in out of curiosity, seeing the Apple I, and taking it home, then word spreading, then more orders, the first ripples of a wave. As they loaded the empty boxes back into the van, Jobs turned to Woz, his grin wide. We're in a store, was a real store, but reality wasn't going to let them bask for long. Being in the bike shop meant they now had to keep up with demand if there was any. They needed marketing, packaging, in a way, to make Apple look like more than two guys in a garage. Jobs began sketching ideas in his head before they even reached home. He wanted a logo, not just letters on a page, but something with story, something people would remember. He called up an old friend, Ron Wayne, to draw out a woodcut-style image of Isaac Newton sitting beneath an apple tree, the fruit hanging just above his head. It was intricate, maybe too intricate, but it gave them something tangible. Apple had an identity, and then it happened. The first customer walked into the bike shop, saw the Apple I, and bought it. No questions, no hesitation, just curiosity and cash. Terrell called Jobs to let him know, and Jobs' voice crackled with excitement over the phone. One sale, just one, but it was proof. Proof that someone outside their circle wanted what they'd made. And for Steve Jobs, proof was all he needed to believe the flood was coming. Back in the garage that night, Jobs ran his hand over the workbench, feeling the scratches, the burn marks, the scattered flecks of solder. He looked at who was already tinkering with ideas for a better, faster machine. This, Jobs said, his voice low but certain, it's just the start. The bike shop had cracked the door open. Now they just had to blow it off the hinges. The phone in the Jobs household was ringing more than usual. At first, it was the bike shop with reorder of small batches, but steady enough to keep the garage humming. Then came calls from other hobbyist stores, from guys who'd heard about those two Steves building something different. A few even claimed they'd seen the Apple I in person and couldn't get it out of their heads. It was subtle at first, like the faint pull of a tide. Orders trickled in, money trickled out just as quickly. Parts, tools, more coffee, more pizza. The garage was alive nearly 24 hours a day now. Friends drifted in and out, lending hands, soldering boards, labeling boxes. The place smelled like flux and cardboard. Sounded like the hiss of irons and the occasional burst of laughter when someone managed to burn a hole in their shirt. Was kept innovating quietly in the background, sketching circuit designs in the margins of scrap paper. He had already begun dreaming of something beyond the Apple I, something with a keyboard built in, color graphics, and a case that didn't look like it belonged in a science lab. Jobs listened, eyes narrowing in thought, already plotting how to make it not just better, but irresistible. One afternoon, a man from a small electronics magazine dropped by. He'd heard of their project and wanted to see it for himself. Jobs cleared the workbench, set up a single unit, and walked him through the idea, not with specs and jargon, but with a vision. This is the start of personal computing. One day, every desk will have one. It won't just be for engineers. It'll be for teachers, kids, artists, everyone. The man scribbled notes, asked a few questions, and left. 2 weeks later, a modest write-up appeared in the back pages of the magazine, but that was all it took. More calls came, more orders. They weren't just selling to hobbyists, now they were selling to early adopters. People who had no formal training in computing, but wanted to be part of something new. Jobs began to see the limits of their current setup. The garage, once their sanctuary, was now a bottleneck. They needed space, they needed equipment, and they needed money. Real money. And Jobs knew where to find it. Silicon Valley was crawling with investors, looking for the next big thing. At night, Jobs would sit cross-legged on the garage floor, staring at the stacks of boards and thinking about scale. Was sitting a few feet away, would be buried in the guts of a prototype for what they were already calling the Apple II. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead was the soundtrack to their partnership. Jobs chasing the future, was building it in real time, but growth came with whispers. Some friends muttered that Jobs was pushing too hard, too fast, that he was already talking like a CEO when they were still just the guys. Surrounded by solder smoke, Jobs brushed it off. He didn't have time for doubt. The garage wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was the nerve center of a movement that no one outside their small circle could fully see yet, but Jobs could. Every sale, every mention in a magazine, every curious customer was another ripple spreading outward, and somewhere beyond the horizon, he could feel the wave building. It was time to leave the garage, time to turn ripples into a surge. The garage smelled of warm solder and ambition. The day Steve Jobs decided they had outgrown it. He didn't say it gently. Jobs rarely did. He simply looked up from the cluttered workbench, where a half-assembled Apple I sat waiting for Wozniak's final touches, and said, "We can't do this here anymore. We're thinking too small." Was looked around at the walls lined with cardboard boxes, spools of wire, the rickety card table where orders were packed, and the battered couch where friends sometimes crashed after late-night work. "This is small," he said with a smile, not looking up from his schematic, "but that's okay. I like small." Jobs stood. He was restless, pacing, his bare feet making soft taps against the concrete floor. Small is fine, until it keeps you from changing the world. It wasn't the first time Jobs had said it, but lately it was coming out like a mantra. For weeks, Jobs had been calling anyone in Silicon Valley who would listen. Most meetings ended with polite nods, handshakes, and no callbacks. But then, one name started floating back to him, Mike Markula, a former Intel executive, barely in his 30s, already retired wealthy, with a reputation for spotting opportunity. Before anyone else did, Jobs got his number through a friend of a friend and cold called him. The pitch was quick, almost breathless. "Mike, this is Steve Jobs. I'm working on a personal computer that's going to change the way people work and live. It's not a hobby, it's the future. I need 15 minutes to show you." Markula's voice on the other end was calm, almost amused. "You sound like a salesman, Steve." "I'm not," Jobs replied. "I'm a visionary, and I'll prove it when I meet you." The meeting happened a few days later at Markula's home in Palo Alto. Jobs arrived in his BWW bus, barefoot, hair wild, was tagged along, carrying a working Apple I in a plain cardboard box. Markula welcomed them in with a curious smile. They set the computer up right there in his living room, was explained the circuitry was quiet, precise detail, hands moving like a musician's. Jobs didn't touch the board, he painted the dream. "In 5 years," he said, "these will be in every office, every home. People won't just be calculating numbers, they'll be creating, writing, designing, running businesses, and we'll be the ones making it possible." Markula didn't say much at first. He asked questions, hard ones about manufacturing, costs, competition. Jobs answered without flinching, was backed it up with engineering brilliance. Finally, Markula leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're not just selling me a product, you're selling me a revolution." Jobs' mouth curled into that familiar half-smile. Exactly 2 weeks later, Markula came back with a proposal. He'd invest $250,000 of fortune to Jobs and was in exchange for a third of the company. But more than the money, he brought credibility, strategy, and a plan to scale. When Jobs hung up the phone after that call, he stood in the middle of the garage, staring at the workbenches as if memorizing them. This place had been the cradle of their dream, but it was time to grow up. The day they moved out, the garage felt almost sacred. Empty tables, coils of wire left behind, faint scorch marks from soldering irons. Jobs ran his hand along the scarred wooden bench. "This is where it started," he murmured, was smiled softly, "and this is where it's going to take off." They locked the door behind them. With Markula's backing, Apple Computer was no longer just a friend in a garage. It was a company registered, funded, and armed with the resources to turn Jobs' impossible vision into reality. And for Jobs, this was only the beginning. He wasn't chasing stability. He was chasing the storm. The night before the launch, Steve Jobs couldn't sleep. He lay in the dim light of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling, the hum of crickets drifting in from the orchard outside. In just a few hours, the world would see what he had been obsessing over for months, the machine that would not just compete with existing computers, but obliterate them. On the desk beside him sat a pristine Apple II, its smooth beige casing catching the faint glow from the streetlight outside. No visible screws, no messy wires, everything enclosed in a design that looked more like a piece of furniture than a machine. Jobs had insisted on it. If we're going to put a computer in someone's home, he had told was, it has to feel like it belongs there. The convention hall the next morning buzzed with the sound of clinking coffee cups, shuffling papers, and the low murmur of early arrivals. Rows of tables displayed the competition, hulking, industrial-looking boxes, beige on beige, with manuals thicker than phone books. Jobs walked in wearing his trademark confidence black turtleneck, jeans, and that electric stare. Was beside him, lugging the Apple E's and a small color TV for the demo. When it was their turn, Jobs didn't waste time. He stepped up to the microphone, looked out over the skeptical faces, and began. "Most computers you see today are built for engineers. They're cold, intimidating, and hard to use. We built something different, something for people." He nodded to Woz, who powered on the Apple II. The screen lit up, not with green text on a black background like everyone expected, but with color. Full, vibrant, breathtaking color. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jobs paced slowly across the stage, letting the audience drink it in. "This," he said, pointing to the TV, "isn't just a computer. It's a bicycle for the mind. It's going to make you faster, smarter, and more creative than you ever thought possible." He demonstrated VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet program, moving numbers around in real time. Accountants and business owners leaned forward in their seats. Then came the game's smooth, colorful graphics that felt more like arcade machines than anything a home computer had ever produced. The crowd erupted into applause. Markula, standing in the wings, watched with a satisfied half smile. He'd seen Jobs sell before, but this was something else. Jobs wasn't just selling a product. He was pulling the future into the room and daring people to touch it. By the end of the convention, Apple's booth was swarmed. Retailers placed orders they didn't even have shelf space for yet. Magazines wanted interviews. Investors who had ignored Jobs months earlier now handed him their cards with shaky hands. That night, in a quiet corner of the hotel bar, was sipped. A Coke and grinned at Jobs. "You realize we just made history, right?" Jobs, ever the restless visionary, stared into his drink. "We didn't make history, we started it. Now we build the future." Back in Cupertino, the Apple that began rolling off the assembly line, they sold not just thousands, but millions. It became the first truly mass-market personal computer, landing in classrooms, offices, and living rooms around the world. But with every success came a shadow. The orders piled up, deadlines tightened, and Jobs' demand for perfection grew. Sharper, harsher. Employees whispered about his reality distortion field, the way he could make you believe in the impossible and then demand you deliver it. The Apple that had put them on top, but for Jobs, it wasn't enough. Perfection was a moving target, and he was determined to hit it again no matter the cost. The office lights burned late into the night at Apple's headquarters. Outside, the California air was cool and quiet, but inside, the atmosphere buzzed with relentless energy. Steve Jobs stood in the middle of the Macintosh team's workspace, barefoot, pacing like a general in the war room. His eyes darted from screen to circuit board, from designer to programmer, urging, pushing, demanding. "This isn't going to be just another computer," he said, his voice low but charged. "This is going to change the way people think. We are going to put the power of a computer into the hands of everyday people, and they won't even have to learn how to use it. It'll just work." The engineers, bleary-eyed and slouched over their keyboards, typed in silence. They were brilliant minds, Burrell Smith, Andy Hertzfeld, Susan Kerr, but they were exhausted. Some hadn't been home in days. Jobs had created an environment where good enough was an insult, where the only acceptable outcome was perfection. One night, Susan Kerr was working on the Macintosh's graphical icons, the trash can, the paintbrush, the happy Mac face. Jobs hovered over her shoulder, pointing. No, make it friendlier. People should smile when they see it. It should feel like it's saying, "Welcome home." Kerr tried another sketch. Jobs grinned. "That's it. That's the one." In another corner, Burrell Smith was designing the logic board. Jobs walked over, picked it up, and turned it over in his hands. "No," he said. "What do you mean, no?" Burrell asked, frustrated. "It's ugly," Jobs replied flatly. Burrell raised an eyebrow. "It's a circuit board. Nobody's going to see it." Jobs locked eyes with him. "We will. And if we're going to make something great, everything matters, even the parts you can't see." The deadlines were brutal. Jobs operated like a filmmaker shooting an epic. Every scene, every pixel, every sound effect had to serve the vision. He pushed his team past exhaustion, but somehow they kept going. Why? Because in Jobs' presence, the impossible seemed possible. His reality distortion field could make you believe you could climb Everest with your bare hands by tomorrow. At one point, the engineers told him the Macintosh couldn't possibly be finished by the January 1980 for launch date. Jobs leaned against the desk, folded his arms, and said, "If it were a matter of life or death, could you get it done?" The room fell silent. He had them. Finally, the prototype came together. It was small, compact, a beautiful and all-in-one design with a crisp black and white screen, a mouse still a novelty, and a friendly, welcoming interface. But Jobs wanted more than just a great product. He wanted a moment, a launch that would burn itself into the public's imagination. That's when he reached out to Ridley Scott to direct the commercial. The result, the now legendary 1980 for a dystopian, cinematic masterpiece showing a lone heroine smashing the tyranny of conformity. On launch day, the team gathered in a packed auditorium. Jobs, dressed in a dark suit and bow tie, stood before the audience with a small, cloth-covered object on the table. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. He pulled off the cloth, revealing the Macintosh. With a theatrical flourish, he turned it on. The screen came to life, and the Macintosh spoke in a clear, synthetic voice. "Hello, I'm Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag." The audience exploded into applause, cheers echoing off the walls. People rushed the stage to get a closer look for a moment. All the sleepless nights, the arguments, the missed holidays, they all seemed worth it. Apple had done it again. But Jobs didn't just see the Macintosh as a triumph, he saw it as the future. He believed it would redefine personal computing forever. What he didn't know was that the very intensity and control that had made the Macintosh possible would soon ignite a firestorm inside Apple One that would ultimately push him out of his own company. The Macintosh had launched with fanfare, applause, and the full force of Steve Jobs' charisma. For a brief moment, Apple felt like the center of the universe. The press hailed Jobs as a visionary. The 1984 ad was already being called one of the greatest commercials ever made. But behind the applause, cracks were forming deep. Dangerous cracks. The reality was sobering. While the Macintosh was revolutionary, it wasn't selling as fast as Jobs had promised. Its $2,495 price tag was steep. Its small memory and lack of compatibility with many business applications frustrated customers. And Jobs' refusal to compromise on design meant it was less practical for some users compared to IBM PCS. Inside Apple's walls, tension simmered. Jobs had been given control over the Macintosh division, but his intense, perfection-driven leadership style had alienated many colleagues. Meetings often turned into interrogations. He had a habit of publicly dismantling ideas he didn't like, sometimes humiliating the people who suggested them. One morning, Jobs stormed into a meeting with the marketing team. "The ads aren't working," he said flatly. "We need to make people feel something when they see the Macintosh, not just know what it does." A marketing manager cautiously replied, "Steve, the ads highlight all the features." Jobs cut him off. "Features? Nobody buys products because of features. They buy because they feel a connection. We're not selling computers. We're selling a revolution." His words inspired some, but others left the room rolling their eyes. They were tired of the impossible deadlines, tired of the emotional whiplash, tired of feeling like they were in a constant state of battle. The board of directors began to take notice. They respected Jobs' genius, but worried about his volatility. And in the middle of this growing unease stood John Sculley, the man Jobs himself had recruited from Pepsi. Jobs had famously asked him, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" At first, Sculley had been in awe of Jobs' vision, but as CEO, he saw the numbers, and they told a troubling story. Apple needed stability. Jobs, in his view, was too unpredictable to provide it. The breaking point came in 1985. Sales were slipping. The Macintosh team was still burning through money, and Sculley and the board wanted changes. Jobs wanted to double down, to push harder, to invest more in the Macintosh even if it meant bleeding cash. One late afternoon, Sculley called Jobs into his office. The tension in the air was thick. "Steve," Sculley began, "we need to make a decision about leadership. The board is losing confidence in how the Macintosh division is being run." Jobs narrowed his eyes. "The Macintosh is the future of this company." "It might be," Sculley said carefully, "but the way you're running it is unsustainable." Jobs leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You're trying to kill the very thing that will save us." "And I'm trying to save Apple," Sculley replied quietly. It all came to a head in a boardroom showdown. The directors sat in silence as Jobs and Sculley made their cases. Jobs argued with passion, painting visions of a future where every home had a Macintosh. Sculley countered with cold, hard numbers. In the end, the board sided with Sculley. Jobs was stripped of his managerial duties. The company he had poured his soul into, the company he had built in his parents' garage, was now moving on without him. The day the decision was made, Jobs walked out of Apple headquarters in a daze. The summer sun was bright, but everything felt muted, colorless. He drove aimlessly through Palo Alto, replaying every moment in his head, every product, every late night, every gamble. For years, Apple had been his entire identity. Without it, who was he? Later, in a small press conference, Jobs tried to put on a brave face. "I suppose when you're young, you build something and then you hand it over. It's a little bit like watching your kid grow up and leave home," he said. But inside, he was gutted. The headlines the next day were merciless. Apple ousts its visionary founder. Jobs forced out of company he created. Friends said Jobs oscillated between depression and determination in those months. He spent hours alone, sketching ideas in notebooks, replaying what went wrong. But slowly, something began to shift. Beneath the hurt, there was a flicker of excitement, freedom. No more board meetings, no more political games. He could start fresh. That flicker would soon ignite. Jobs wasn't done changing the world. He was just getting started. Next came Next and Pixar, and eventually a return to Apple that would make history. Steve Jobs left Apple with a bruised ego, a battered reputation, and $7 million in cash from the sale of his Apple shares. Most people would have taken a long vacation, maybe bought an island, and tried to forget the humiliation. Jobs, he decided, to build another company to prove everyone wrong. I'll show them, he told a friend. They haven't seen what I can really do yet. In September 1985, just weeks after leaving Apple, Jobs founded Next Inc. His goal was ambitious too. Ambitious, some said. He wanted to create the most powerful, most beautiful workstation computer ever made. Aimed at universities and research institutions. From the beginning, Next felt different. Jobs insisted on perfection in every detail: the magnesium casing, the smooth edges, even the sound the disk drive made when inserting a floppy. He hired top-tier engineers, many poached directly from Apple, and pushed them with his usual intensity. One engineer recalled Jobs examining a prototype and saying, "The screws are wrong." The engineer blinked. "Steve, they're inside the case. No one will see them." Jobs replied without hesitation, "I will." Next hardware was sleek and elegant. Its operating system, Next Step, was ahead of its time, featuring a graphical interface, multitasking, and object-oriented programming when most PCs were still fumbling with clunky DOS prompts. But there was a problem. The Next computer cost $6,500, far too expensive for most schools, the very audience it was built for. While educators loved the design, budgets said otherwise. Sales were slow still. Jobs didn't see failure. He saw refinement. "We're building the foundation for the future," he told his team. And in a strange twist, he was right years later. Next Step software would form the core of MacOS when Jobs returned to Apple. But while Next struggled to gain traction, another opportunity was quietly brewing, one that had nothing to do with computers. In 1986, Jobs met Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith, two computer scientists from Lucasfilm's graphics division. They were working on advanced computer animation technology, but George Lucas, going through a divorce and financial trouble, was selling the division. Jobs bought it for $10 million, renamed it Pixar, and became its majority shareholder. At first, Pixar didn't make movies, it sold high-end computer graphics workstations. But just like Next, the hardware was too expensive to move in large numbers. Meanwhile, the animation team was making short films to showcase their technology. One of them, Luxo Jr., was nominated for an Academy Award in 1986. Jobs was fascinated. He began to see Pixar not just as a tech company, but as a storytelling powerhouse. He funded the team year after year, even as the company bled money. Most investors would have pulled the plug. Jobs didn't. "Great things take time," he said. That time came in 1991, when Pixar signed a 3-film deal with Disney. The first project, an animated feature about a cowboy doll and a Space Ranger toy story. Jobs poured his energy and millions more of his own money into making it happen. When Toy Story finally released in 1995, it wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. The world's first fully computer animated feature film grossed over $350 million worldwide. Jobs, who had been struggling for years to prove himself after Apple, suddenly found himself at the helm of one of the hottest companies in Hollywood. Overnight, his fortune skyrocketed. Pixar's IPO turned Jobs into a billionaire for the first time. But more than money, Toy Story gave him something he had lost since leaving Apple: validation. He could build world-changing companies. He could lead creative revolutions outside of Silicon Valley. By the mid-90s, Jobs had the company's one still struggling Next and one soaring Pixar. What he didn't know was that these two paths would soon converge, leading him back to the company that had once cast him out. Apple, without Jobs, was floundering, and they were about to make a decision that would bring him home. By 1996, Apple was in freefall. The company that once revolutionized personal computing was bleeding cash, losing market share, and shipping products nobody wanted. Apple had released a confusing lineup of computers with awkward names like Performa 6400 and Quadra 605. The visionary magic was gone. Competitors like Microsoft were dominating, and Apple's board was desperate. One of their biggest problems, they needed a modern operating system. The Mac OS, built in the 1980s, was now outdated and buggy. Apple's engineers had tried building a new one from scratch, but the project codenamed Copland was a disaster. After years of delays, they scrapped it entirely. They began searching for a company with a ready-made, modern OS they could buy. That search led them to NeXT Dot in December 1996. Apple announced it was acquiring Next for $429 million. On paper, it was a simple deal. Apple got Next Step's advanced software and Next team, including Steve Jobs, would join Apple. But in reality, it was the start of one of the greatest comebacks in business history. At first, Jobs returned as an advisor, but that title was misleading. From the moment he walked back into Apple's Cupertino campus, he started making changes. He met with engineers, designers, and executives and quickly spotted there were too many products. To little focus, no clear vision. By mid-1997, the board ousted then CEO Gil Amelio, and Jobs stepped in as interim CEO, or as he called himself, Ichio. Apple's stock was in the gutter. Analysts predicted bankruptcy within 90 days. Jobs wasted no time swinging the axe. He slashed Apple's product line from dozens of confusing models to just four: a desktop and laptop for consumers and a desktop and laptop for professionals. Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do, he told his team. He also made bold moves to save the company financially. In a jaw-dropping announcement at Macworld 1997, Jobs revealed a partnership with none other than Microsoft, Apple's biggest rival. Bill Gates appeared via satellite, pledging $150 million in investment, a commitment to continue developing Microsoft Office for Mac. The crowd booed, but Jobs silenced them. We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. Beyond the finances, Jobs began injecting Apple with his signature design philosophy. Again, products that were not only powerful, but beautiful and easy to use. He recruited Jony Ive, a young British designer, and the two formed a legendary partnership. Together, they began working on a product that would announce Apple's rebirth, the iMac. When it launched in 1998, the iMac was unlike anything else on the market. It came in translucent candy colors, had no floppy drive, and featured a handle, so you could just grab it and go. Critics scoffed at its unconventional look, but consumers loved it. Apple sold nearly 800,000 units in its first 5 months. The iMac didn't just save Apple, it made it cool again. Suddenly, the same company everyone thought was dead was setting trends. Jobs was back in full force, demanding, uncompromising, and laser-focused. His team worked brutal hours, but they were building something meaningful again. He ended meaningless side projects, killed off the Newton PDA, and stopped licensing the Mac OS to third-party manufacturers. Apple, once scattered, was now moving as one. By the end of 1999, Apple was profitable again. Jobs had done what many thought impossible. He not only saved the company, but positioned it for an era of explosive innovation, and he was just getting started. It was the early 2000s, and the air inside Apple's headquarters felt different. Gone was the smell of slow death that had clung to the halls in the mid-90s. Now, there was energy, electric, urgent, almost impossible to contain. Every corner buzzed with a sense of possibility, like the whole place was holding its breath before a leap. Steve Jobs stood at the center of it all, a black turtleneck against the stark white walls of a product lab, holding something small in his palm. This, he said quietly, almost like a secret, is going to change everything. It was a prototype for the iPod. The world didn't know it yet, but the iPod was the first spark in a chain reaction that would redefine not just Apple, but music, communication, entertainment, life itself. In 2001, portable music players existed, but they were clunky, ugly, and could barely hold a handful of songs. Jobs, as always, saw past the mess to the essence. People didn't just want to carry music. They wanted to carry their world in their pocket. The iPod was sleek, white, and almost impossibly simple. 1,000 songs in your pocket. The click wheel was satisfying, the interface intuitive. It didn't just play music. It invited you to use it. When Jobs unveiled it on October 23, 2001, the reaction was cautious at first, but within months, the iPod exploded. White earbuds became a status symbol, the soundtrack to a generation's daily commute. And Apple, it wasn't just a computer company anymore, it was a cultural force. But Jobs wasn't done. He saw how the digital revolution was colliding with everything phones, cameras, music, the internet, and he envisioned a single device that could merge them all seamlessly. It sounded impossible at the time. Mobile phones were dominated by clunky Nokias and Blackberries. Touch screens were slow and unresponsive. The idea of combining a phone, music player, and internet communicator into one elegant package, that was science fiction. Yet in 2007, on a stage in San Francisco, Jobs stepped into the spotlight and, with a mischievous smile, announced, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." The iPhone wasn't just a new gadget, it was a revolution. Glass and aluminum replaced plastic buttons and keypads. You could pinch, swipe, and tap your way through emails, maps, music, and the web. Jobs didn't just launch a product, he rewrote the rules of an entire industry in 90 minutes. Crowds lined up for days to get one. Competitors scrambled to copy it. The iPhone wasn't just a hit, it was a tidal wave that would wash over every corner of modern life. And while the world was still catching its breath from that, Apple dropped another bomb in 2010, the iPad. Critics mocked it as just a big iPhone. They didn't understand. Jobs was never making products for critics, he was building tools for the future. The iPad opened a new chapter in how we consume media, worked, learned, and connected. Every launch became an event, a kind of modern theater where the curtain would rise and Jobs would pull an object from his pocket, or a manila envelope, pausing just long enough for the suspense to boil over. He didn't just sell devices, he sold a vision of how the world could be. Apple's stock soared. Its market value climbed into the hundreds of billions. Products were no longer just tools. They were part of people's identity. The Apple Store became a cultural landmark. Designed in California became a global stamp of desire. But for Jobs, the true victory wasn't in numbers, it was in the moment someone picked up an iPhone or an iPod and smiled, realizing it just worked. The beauty, the elegance, the human connection, that was his art. The iRevolution wasn't about technology alone. It was about making technology feel personal, intimate, almost alive. And by the time the world realized it, Steve Jobs had already set his sights on what came next. The summer light poured through the windows of Steve Jobs' Palo Alto home, golden and almost too warm for the quiet inside. By then, the world knew he was sick. The thinness in his frame, the slow gait, the way his black turtleneck seemed to hang on him, these were things no stagecraft could hide. But if the disease was trying to take his energy, Jobs refused to let it take his vision. It had begun years earlier, with a diagnosis he had kept private for as long as he could. Pancreatic cancer, rare, aggressive, and merciless. The kind that didn't care if you had changed the world or built the most valuable company on earth. It was a foe that couldn't be outdesigned, outnegotiated, or outthought. Yes, Steve approached it the only way he knew how, with relentless focus. Even when surgeries and treatments left him drained, he worked. Meetings at his home, conference calls from hospital rooms, sketches and prototypes scattered across his bed. He was still shaping the future, one product, one idea, one pixel at a time. In August 2011, the letter came, the one that would be read around the world. I'd have always said that if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come. He signed it simply, Steve. The resignation shook the tech world. Apple wasn't just losing a CEO, it was losing its soul, its storyteller, its uncompromising visionary. Tim Cook would take the helm, but even he knew there was no replacing Steve Jobs. In those final weeks, Jobs spent more time at home with Lorene and their children. The once public man became a quieter figure, often found in the garden or at the dinner table, talking about ideas, philosophy, and the things that mattered most. Friends who visited spoke of a man at peace with his path, even if the end was near, yet his mind never stopped turning. Sketches for future Apple products, notes on design principles, thoughts on where the world was heading, they filled his notebooks and conversations. On October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. The news traveled faster than any Apple keynote. Crowds gathered outside Apple stores, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. World leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs all spoke of the man who had changed the way they saw the world. Bill Gates, his longtime rival and occasional collaborator, wrote, "For those of us lucky enough to get to work with him, it's been an insanely great honor. I will miss Steve immensely." President Barack Obama said Steve was among the greatest of American innovators, brave enough to think differently, bold enough to believe he could change the world, and talented enough to do it. And in the quiet corners of the internet, in dorm rooms and coffee shops, people tapped at their iPhones, swiped on their iPads, or clicked on their MacBooks and realized that, in some way, they were touching a piece of his legacy. Steve Jobs once said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." He had been crazy enough, and he did. Even in death, his vision continued to ripple outward, shaping not just the products we use, but the way we live, create, and connect. Every pinch to Zoom, every song played on white earbuds, every FaceTime call between people continents apart, these were threads in the tapestry he had woven. Our revolution was never just about devices. It was about empowering human beings to think differently, to create, to dream bigger than the world told them was possible. And maybe that was the real product Steve Jobs had been working on all along. Throughout Steve's journey, let's naturally embed useful vocabulary and expressions, then pause briefly to explain them in a conversational way. Just like a YouTube English learning storyteller would example section and story, Steve Jobs once said, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." Here, the word hungry doesn't mean wanting food. It means having a strong desire for success or learning. And foolish here means being willing to take risks and try unconventional ideas, even if others think they're strange. Steve faced setbacks, meaning failures or delays, when he was fired from Apple. But instead of giving up, he turned them into stepping stones, meaning opportunities to move forward. He was known for his attention to detail. This phrase means caring about every small part of something, making sure it's perfect. When Steve spoke about connecting the dots, it was an idiom, meaning you can only understand how past events fit together when you look back later. By explaining words like setback, stepping stone, attention to detail, and idioms like connect the dots inside the story, the audience not only feels the emotion, but also learns English in a living, breathing way. Embrace failure as fuel. Every no or rejection can be the foundation for your next breakthrough. Protect your vision fiercely. If you see something clearly in your mind, don't let others dilute it. Keep learning. Stay hungry for knowledge and foolish enough to explore new ideas. Think different. Don't just improve what exists. Imagine what doesn't exist yet. Leave a legacy, not just a product. What you build should outlive you. Steve Jobs' story isn't just about technology. It's about what's possible when one person refuses to accept the limits the world sets for them. He showed us that the tools we create can shape the future, but it's the dreams we hold that truly change it. So when you wake up tomorrow, don't just ask, "What do I have to do today?" Ask, "What can I create today that will still matter 10 years from now?" Because somewhere out there, the next idea that changes the world is waiting for someone, maybe you, to believe in it enough to bring it to life.